Calvinism's Surprising Catholic Connection, Chapter 4. As for Calvin's theology, there is no question that rather than deriving it from a diligent study of the Bible, he imposed upon the Bible certain preconceived ideas from his Roman Catholic background, which locked him into an erroneous interpretation. Many leading Calvinists agree that the writings of Augustine were the actual source of most of what is known as Calvinism today. Calvinist David Steele and Curtis Thomas point out that the basic doctrines of the Calvinist position had been vigorously defended by Augustine against Pelagius during the 5th century. In his eye-opening book, The Other Side of Calvinism, Lawrence M. Vance thoroughly documents that John Calvin did not originate the doctrines that bear his name. This is stated emphatically by Calvinists. Vance quotes numerous well-known Calvinists to this effect. For example, Kenneth G. Talbot and W. Gray Crampton write, The system of doctrines. So let me start over again. Quote, the system of doctrine which bears the name of John Calvin was in no way originated by him. End of quote. B.B. Warfield declared, quote, the system of doctrine taught by Calvin is just the Augustinianism common to the whole body of the Reformers. End of quote. Thus, the debt which the creeds coming out of the Reformation owed to Augustine is also acknowledged. This is not surprising in view of the fact that most of the Reformers had been part of the Roman Catholic Church, of which Augustine was the most highly regarded saint, and Calvin and Luther continued to revere him and his doctrines. C.H. Spurgeon admitted that, quote, perhaps Calvin himself derived Calvinism, in brackets, the word, mainly from the writings of Augustine, end of quote. Alvin L. Baker wrote, quote, there is hardly a doctrine of Calvin that does not bear the marks of Augustine's influence, end of quote. For example, the following from Augustine sounds like an echo reverberating through the writings of Calvin. Okay. Reverberate. If a loud, deep sound reverberates, it continues to be heard around an area, so that the area seems to shake. If an event or an idea reverberates somewhere, it has an effect on everyone or everything in a place or group of sound to continue to be heard to echo repeatedly. Okay. So here, for example, the following from Augustine sounds like an echo reverberating through the writings of Calvin, which is, I think, has an effect on everyone or everything in a place or group. Even as he has appointed them to be regenerated, whom he predestinated to everlasting life, as the most merciful bestower of grace, whilst to those whom he has predestinated to eternal death, he is also the most righteous awarder of punishment. Period. C. Greg Singer said, quote, "The main features of Calvin's theology are found in the writings of St. Augustine to such an extent that many theologians regard Calvinism as a more fully developed form of Augustinianism." End of quote. Such statements are staggering declarations in view of the undisputed fact that, as Vance points out, the Roman Catholic Church itself has a better claim on Augustine than do the Calvinists. Period. Consider the following from Calvin himself. Augustine is so whole with me that if I wish to write a confession of my faith, I could do so with all fullness and satisfaction to myself out of his writings. End of quote. Period. Augustine and the use of force. In the 4th century, the Donatists led a movement for purification of the church. They believed that the church should be a pure communion of true believers who demonstrated the truth of the gospel in their lives. Okay, What is Donatism? Donatism was a heretical sect of Christianity that challenged the established church in the 4th century as Catholicism was on the rise. Donatism, which began in North Africa, taught that Christians were called to asceticism and personal purity, and that holiness was proved in one's faithfulness and enduring persecution. Period. Those whose faith wavered under threat of death were impure and not worthy of being members of the church. The Donatists considered theirs as the only true church and refused to acknowledge ordinance administered in other churches. Period. The background of Donatism involves the Roman persecution of the church. In AD 303, Emperor Diocletian mounted a severe persecution against all Christians. All churches and Christian sculptures were to be destroyed. During the persecution, many Christians betrayed other Christians to the Romans or handed over their copies of the Bible. These traitors became known as traitores, or Christians who turned in other Christians to the government. In the minds of many Christians, the sin of betrayal was a mark of evil character that could not be overcome. In AD 311, Caecilian was consecrated as Bishop of Carthage. One of the 3 bishops involved in the ceremony was Felix of Apatunga, who had earlier handed over copies of the Bible to the Romans to be destroyed. Thus, Bishop Philip was a traitor. A group of about 70 other bishops considered Bishop Felix to be unfit for the office because of his betrayal, and since Felix was unfit, the consecration of Bishop Caecilian was null and void. The bishops in opposition of Felix formed a synod and refused to acknowledge Bishop Caecilian as a valid church official. The debate over Caecilian expanded to include the validity of the sacraments administered by Felix and other traitores. How could someone who had betrayed the word of God be holding Christian office? The low moral character of the officiant was seen as annulling the grace supposedly received through the sacraments he dispensed. Okay. After Caecilian died, the bishopric of Carthage went to Aelius Donatus the Great. The term Donatus comes from his name. Bishop Dantus continued to advance the idea that any traitor who administered a sacrament polluted the sacrament to such an extent that it was no longer a conveyor of grace. Not only was a traitor to be excommunicated, but also all those who held fellowship with a traitor. The church was to be made of saints, not sinners, and the Donatists began to rebaptize Christians who had been baptized in other churches. In doing so, they separated themselves from all other churches and basically upheld themselves as the only authoritative church body. The Donatist issue was raised at several church councils, including the Council of Nicaea. In every council, the Donatist position was rejected. Donatism, however, continued its influence until Augustine of Hippo wrote a series of books, letters, and sermons that refuted the Donatist movement and argued that the effect of a sacrament is independent of the moral character of the minister. Donatists eventually died out in the 5th century. The main problem with Donatism is that no person is pure in the sight of God. Romans 3, verse 23. If absolute holiness is required to serve God, then we are all unfit. Also, Donatism's view of sin was too narrow. The Donatists demanded rectitude of the priests and bishops and other church leaders according to their own definition of rectitude, namely, an embrace of asceticism and unwavering fortitude under persecution. But as Jesus taught, moral uprightness involves much more than external conformity to a church standard. Let's look up this word. Rectitude, yeah. Honesty and correct moral behavior. Okay. All right. And then Donatist. Going to the bottom. So the Donatists demanded rectitude of the priests and bishops and other church leaders according to their own definition of rectitude, namely an embrace of asceticism and unwavering fortitude under persecution. But as Jesus taught, moral uprightness involves much more than external conformity to